we outcompeted the other PLATO group because we got to you first, Ben, and I'm really delighted. We do have some background in nuclear energy. I think over the past 10 years, various people, including me as organizer, have given about probably at least 7 or 8 lectures on various aspects of nuclear energy, including somebody you might know, Helen Tucker. We reviewed his book last year. So we do have some background in it, and we're very concerned, I am in particular, about the high cost of and delays in construction of plants. So I'm delighted on your topic and looking forward to it very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Just let me get my slides up.
Okay.
And yeah, I'm now sharing, and let me get that full screen. Is that working properly for everybody?
Working fine for me.
Yes, looks great.
Looks great here.
Excellent, thank you. So thank you for the introduction, Richard. Today I'm going to give a talk about cost overruns in nuclear power and how to address them. And for me, this is a really important topic because, in my opinion, cost is really the difference between whether nuclear reactors are deployed at scale over the next few decades or whether the nuclear industry dwindles and dies. Now, there are other factors. There is what people's perception of nuclear, there is waste, there is policy, there is consent-based siding. All of these are really important. But the bottom line right now is that nuclear reactors could be built if we could build them at cost in a cost-competitive manner. And recent constructions have gone wrong, and in some cases, a lot of cases, been cancelled because of this issue. Now, the first thing I want to do is sort of set a baseline for why, in my opinion, we need nuclear power and the role it will play, and hence what the target costs of nuclear power would be before going into how to get there. I'll try and go over that first bit reasonably quickly to sort of get to the meat of it, which is on nuclear costs. And finally, I'd say at any time, if anyone wants to ask a question, I guess raise a hand and I'm happy to discuss things at any point. So firstly, if we look at what the Energy Information Administration, so the US body that predicts future energy uses, they don't think any new nuclear reactors will get built. So this is the electricity generation projection over the next 30 years. Now, this is a couple of years out of date now, but things have not changed radically in these projections since then. And what we see is that nuclear currently provides 19% of electricity, or at least as of 2019 it was, and it's predicted to drop off a bit, partly through closures of plants as they get old, and partly through just electricity increasing. So we'll keep operating these plants that already exist, but not open any new ones. Now, what we see is slight increases in natural gas use and major increases in variable renewables. So lots more solar and lots more wind projected to happen.
Could I raise a question at this point?
Yep.
We've been hearing lately that the grid cannot absorb anything much more than 20%. And there's already a 4-year delay on many of these renewable applications. Do you not think that 38% is way overly optimistic?
So I'm sort of a meta study sort of person on this. I'm not expert enough to say what the grid limit is. What I will come on to is some estimates of costs of the transmission issues you described, and hence set a target cost for nuclear based on them. What I can say is that there's certainly disagreement within the community who does this sort of thing on how big variable renewables can get. And the sort of the low end that people think, there's some people who say anything more than 50% that's non-baseload and will have problems. I mean, at the other end, there are some studies and some academics and some projections that say do the whole thing with variable renewables. And what I'll take in my numbers is sort of the middle of the road between those extremes. And so where I'll get is say that there seems to be consensus around 70% variable renewables being the point at which things start to get really tricky. Sorry, I can't give a more firm answer on that.
Fair enough.
So just sort of showing the same information in a different way. These are new generating capacity additions, withdrawals. And what this is predicting is some coal and a little bit of nuclear being retired over the next 10 years. A lot of solar capacity being added, and also rather a lot of oil and gas capacity being added out to 2050. So again, this is the central projection from US EIA. Now, one thing you need to bear in mind is that electricity is only one component of our energy use, and we also use a significant amount of energy industrially, so that's industrial heat, transportation, obviously, your cars, planes, etc. And residential commercial heating are also non-trivial. And this is important if we start caring about things like carbon dioxide emissions and also our wider energy mix. Because even if we decarbonize electricity to some degree, then we could end up affecting very little else. And then even if we started to deploy electric vehicles at scale, that still leaves heating as well. And I should mention, I very much approach this problem as that we should decarbonize the planet, otherwise future generations are in serious trouble. And I know that's not a settled position in the US. When I ask my class this, when I give presentations in rural Wisconsin on this, I find that about half of people really care about climate change and the other half do not. And I'm in the care category on climate change. I appreciate you might not be. But the other reason for doing this, or the other reason we might care about this, is energy security. And most people can get behind the idea that we want to have energy security. And that broadly means we want to generate domestic, and that would also means we want to reduce reliance on fossil fuels, of which we import quite a lot. Now, getting into some of the transmission issues that Richard mentioned, the sort of issue we start to have if we end up with lots of, say, solar power is sort of a manifestation of the what if the sun isn't shining problem. And in particular, the sun shines in the middle of the day. And so what we end up with is this big sort of green bulge in the middle of the central and the right charts, which is solar power coming online in the middle of the day. And that sort of dips net demand for everything else. So generators that can choose whether or not they generate to quite low levels. Now then later in the day, especially in places with large use of AC, solar power comes offline, AC cranks up late afternoon when it's the hottest part of the day, and you end up with this big peak in demand around 5 o'clock. Now I'll come on to that a bit more in a minute. And just to summarize then, so this sort of do nothing scenario, but no changes in policy, no changes in nuclear costs. We say no new nuclear construction, no reductions in CO2 emissions from the United States out to 2050, little electrification of transport or heating, and continued construction of fossil fuel plants. And the central issue of the nuclear power is capital cost. Okay? So the nuclear plants, you need to build them, then you need to pay people to staff them, and then you need to put fuel in them, and then you need to decommission them and deal with the waste. Now, the single dominant factor from this big ugly blue bar on the right of my plot on the screen, so on the left of the plot on the screen, is the capital cost of new nuclear power. Okay? Everything else is pretty small by comparison. Uranium is essentially free for all intents and purposes. Operations and maintenance is significant. You do need quite a lot of staff to run a nuclear plant, more than you need a gas plant. That's especially true of our current reactors as they're aging. They're 30 years old, so 40 years old in many cases. So that means that you need to maintain everything. And one sort of misconception is the idea that decommissioning disposal costs are large. Now, they are large in absolute terms. People throw numbers around like $100 billion for US management of waste. But if you look at $100 billion compared to 20% of your electricity for 60 years, it's not actually very high. And on top of this, discounting effects mean that it doesn't really affect the cost of new nuclear construction, right? Because you build a new reactor, in 70 years' time, you need to decommission it, right? Inflation style effects mean that cost barely makes a tick when you're trying to decide whether you build your plant. So this is all in terms of new build. Now, a few years ago, and I'll elaborate this on the next slide, a few years ago, well, a year ago, current nuclear was struggling against current gas, and we saw nuclear plants shut down because of this. And that's the two bars on the right here, where current nuclear is a little bit more expensive than gas. Now, even though the fuel for nuclear is cheap, what it really came down to is these operations costs and maintenance. And as I've mentioned, they're higher than gas. And so what we had up until about a year ago, and you can probably guess where I'm going with this, was that nuclear plants were being shut down in some cases for economic reasons. And that was because the current plants, even having already built the plant, could not compete with gas because gas was so cheap. And the amount they couldn't compete by isn't very high. It was about $12 a megawatt hour. So, it's of the order of 20% of the cost of electricity or something like that. But that's enough to mean that plants were closing. Now, the picture has radically changed for existing plants over the past few years, over the past year, right? So first off, the bipartisan infrastructure bill introduced tax credits for nuclear power, which is enough to bring them back to being competitive. And secondly, gas prices have increased. Thirdly, people really, really care about energy security in light of geopolitical events. So now, for example, our local utilities, or the closest we have, so Constellation Power in Illinois, are talking about how do we get more power out of our reactors, not are we shutting them down. So big change. And there's also been some state policies. So New York, Illinois, and New Jersey in particular subsidize nuclear power for some time. Some of those are based on the social cost of carbon. And then the picture for different states is important. So states like California, much of New England, and Minnesota have moratoriums on new construction. So there is a ban on building new nuclear plants. And Minnesota's talked about lifting this ban, on and off over the last few years. But again, to some extent, it's been moot because there hasn't been much economic drive to build reactors.
Dr. Lindley?
Yes.
I have a question. This is Tony Praza. The question is associated with the social cost of carbon. If we look at what happens when we have a gas plant continuing to burn, it's a lot more efficient than coal, of course, and has a lot less impact as far as the environment. But the methane that escapes that causes serious problems over the next short term, a number of years, and then what changes into CO2 when you burn that natural gas, that social cost of carbon and the number of people that are impacted around the world as we burn those fossil fuels sure seems like that should be a major factor taken into consideration. And it isn't, other than I think Europe is doing a little bit better job of it, unfortunately. Or fortunately, I should say.
Thank you, Tony. And yes, I absolutely agree. And I think through the case of these particular states, I think two of those three states had said, we've calculated what you said. I don't know if they included methane or not, but certainly the global warming potential of the burning gas, and said it comes to about $10 to $20 a megawatt hour, which is enough to keep those nuclear plants online, for example. And yes, in Europe, I think they're doing quite a bit of a better job. There's still a long way to go to actually decarbonize and implement these policies in Europe. But my impression coming from Britain, for example, was that the agreement that something needs to be done is a lot higher. And there are things like carbon pricing mechanisms in place. And if you look at central projections for what the UK equivalent of the EIA talks about, they talk about decarbonizing net zero by 2050. If I poll an audience of most political stripes in the UK and say, do you think climate change is a problem, then people all put their hands up. We're a long way closer than in the US to solving it. Solving it for sure. I say solving it.
Response.
Sorry, Tony, I cut you off there, but thank you.
I was just saying, thanks for your response.
Now, one thing that can change the picture quite a bit is if we get serious about using electric vehicles, and also decarbonizing electrifying things like industrial and building heating. Now, if that is done at scale, this can lead to dramatic, i.e., doubling of the size of the electricity demand, right? So there's a couple of scenarios shown here, which are from National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And those same studies start looking at, well, how would you get lower carbon dioxide emissions, and what would scenarios like that look like? And the scenarios I showed on the previous plot were some of these yellow dashed lines down towards the bottom of my slide. Let's see if I can get a laser pointer. So these lines. And then that's also fairly consistent with the target for carbon reduction that the Obama administration had. So where we are going with carbon emissions at the moment in the US is flat. Various decarbonization scenarios can drive this down. Let me get my pointer back. And in NREL's scenario, they did not consider nuclear power. They were looking at high penetration of renewables. That's their remit. That's fine. But I don't want to dig into too much of the details on this slide, but in order to get this electricity generation, they had a lot of wind. That's let me get my pointer. That's this. They had loads of wind. They had loads of solar. That's up here. Now, this bit is natural gas. And then if they really wanted to get high decarbonization, which is the bottom of those two lines that I showed, they said, take out the natural gas and put in natural gas with carbon capture storage. So for NREL, the Renewable Labs scenarios of how to get deep decarbonization, they are saying do loads and loads and loads of variable renewables. And to be clear, the variable renewables are great. They have come down in price, they are clean, they are domestic, they're fantastic. It's about what we do with the rest of the power source. And what they have at the bottom here is something that's coming from gas, potentially with carbon capture and storage. Now, another way of doing this, and this is like a think tank, very similar results to NREL. Where I got these bigger lots was all the variable renewables that they wanted to put in. And at the bottom, this was a scenario that had an expansion of nuclear. So that was saying, well, instead of using carbon capture and storage, let's use nuclear power. And what we see there is, in the grand scheme of things, looks small. But if you think about how big the US grid is and how much power we need, it's still quite a lot. It's still an expansion of nuclear. So this, as a nuclear engineer, is what I think that nuclear power needs to provide, and what we as the nuclear industry need to do by getting our costs under control. We need to provide 20 to 30 or 40% of US electricity by 2050. That is an enormous number of nuclear plants. That's building 100 new nuclear plants. Many of them at one site, maybe, but a lot. And at the moment, we're not there. And the problem is cost. And this is a sort of seen as reputable unbiased source on costs of various electricity supplies. I think this is 2020, so it might be a tad out of date, but it's not far off. A few things I want to sort of point out here. So solar PV is here, so $40 a megawatt. Now, this isn't including all the generation costs. So Richard mentioned distribution, transmission, backups, all of those issues, doesn't include any of them. So this like really, really cheap number for renewables gets quoted a lot. It's not the big picture. The big picture is shifted up by this red arrow and puts us maybe somewhere around here, right? That's if renewables were completely paying their way and saying, yes, I'm generating power at $40 a megawatt, but I'm generating it when I want, where I want, and there's a cost associated with accounting, with transmission systems and so on. But it's still cheaper than new nuclear, which according to this Lazard source is all the way up here, $118 to $192 a megawatt. I will address why that is soon. New nuclear power stations are down here. Coal is here. The top end of coal is carbon capture and storage. And then wind is similar to solar, offshore wind a little higher.
This is Tony again. I got another question for you.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, one of the key elements that is not shown here, other than in the solar, thermal, tower, and storage, is battery backup.
Yeah.
So solar and wind seem really great, even, you know, when the sun's shining and the wind's blowing, as they say. But you need that backup in order to make sure you continue to keep the lights on and or power your car during your evening hours when you're regenerating the batteries so that you can drive the next day to work. So it's a key factor that's not on this chart. I think they show it somewhere else in their schedules, but I don't think they've done a good job yet. I don't think anybody has a true understanding of how that's going to impact the cost long term.
Absolutely, Tony.
Can I say one thing? This is Lou. But the problem with solar storage, it's not generating. It doesn't generate anything. It stores, and it does get the EIA graphs bring it in, but you got to be careful. It's not bringing really new energy in. That's all I want to say. Sorry for the interruption.
Thank you, Lou. I absolutely agree. And in terms of trying to put some numbers on these costs, there's a study here that estimates the cost. Now, I'll declare this study comes from the nuclear industry. So it comes from an organization called the Nuclear Energy Agency, which is a sort of international research agency based in Paris. So they're reputable, but of course they like nuclear power. You know, having said this, what they project is that system costs might be $10 to $20 per megawatt hour, sort of at the current penetrations, which is enough to shift those lines up. If you start going up to 3/4 of your electricity supply, then it becomes more like $40, $50 a megawatt hour. And so that's more than double the current cost, essentially. And if you add those system costs onto the cost of the variable renewables, then that becomes of the order of $100 a megawatt hour in, say, 2020 economics. And that's to say that at that point, a nuclear plant that's costing $100 a megawatt hour becomes competitive with adding more solar to the grid, because it helps balance out the need for all of these additional batteries, all of the interconnections. You need additional transmission generation infrastructure, and the cost of backup power supply to when everything else runs out. And this duck curve at the top is another representation of what I've already shown. It's dealing with this big dip in the day when the sun isn't shining, and also dealing with things like seasonal effects. So this sets a very rough target price for what we need new nuclear to be of $100 a megawatt hour. And throwing out that number, people would say, oh, that's twice as much as variable renewables. But as Tony and Lou have said, and I'm saying, we're not trying to compete with that first 10% of variable renewables. We're trying to compete with, once there's high penetrations, when we've got these distorted electricity prices to try and even things out.
Can I just ask you a quick question? This is Doug Edwards. Just curious if you could comment on the effect of demand management on all of this.
So I'll comment as a sort of educated bystander. So I'm not an expert on it, but I can make a couple of comments. I think some of the NREL studies suggested that demand management with, say, car batteries can help flatten demand. And that I think some of the studies I'm quoting here, so these numbers like this $100 a megawatt hour, I think some of them factored in demand management into those numbers. I guess the final big picture point I'll make is that seasonality is quite difficult to cope with this way, right? We can move demand around in the day, moving demand between summer and winter, which is the sort of thing we start worrying about if we have lots of solar power, becomes harder. So sorry, and that's not a complete answer, but it's all I know.
I'd like to ask another question. and that is I don't see anywhere here the fact that the renewables, particularly wind and solar, need to be replaced about 3 to 4 times more often than nuclear plants. And they've done some studies. A Finnish website, Thoughtscapism, using Sweden and Korea as examples, have shown that when you take the duration of the equipment into account, it doesn't look nearly as bad. Nuclear, that is, doesn't look nearly as bad compared to the other sources of energy.
So could I ask Richard on that? I mean, how do they deal with discounting effects in that? Because with all of these projects, 20 years is after 20 years, discounting sort of done. But obviously, having something that lasts 3 times as long is great. There's a good argument that discount rates aren't a very sustainable way of looking at the world. But I just want to have it opposed to economics.
Well, I'm not sure about that, but nuclear does have its decommissioning cost built in up front, whereas that has not happened with the other sources of energy. So, but I'm not sure about that. I'll send you the link to the Thoughtscapism one if you haven't seen it. I think it worth bringing in, but most people don't bring that into account.
Okay, thank you, Richard. I'd be interested to read that. That'd be great.
Okay. Yeah.
And so, moving on from sort of variable renewables, then it becomes what's nuclear competing with to try and supply the piece of the electricity puzzle that is not, or a piece of the energy puzzle that isn't variable renewables. Now, going back to the plot I had up a couple of slides ago, it's quite difficult for nuclear to compete with gas. At least it was before the Ukraine war. How the Ukraine war changes this picture, I have not seen up-to-date data on. But the problem is that, well, the problem for nuclear is gas is down here, or at least it was pre-Ukraine. Yeah. Coal is a bit more expensive. Coal's also very bad for the environment. Once you start looking at carbon capture storage, these costs start shifting a bit upwards. So what I'm trying to do here is, to some extent, the argument for nuclear gets tied to how much we care about strategic considerations, i.e. energy storage and energy security and climate change and the environment, rather than being a straight up economic thing, because in the US, it is difficult to compete with gas. This is not, say, the case in other countries, right? In Europe, gas is expensive enough that nuclear, even quite expensive nuclear, can compete with gas. Here it is different. Carbon capture and storage increases the costs associated with fossil fuel generation. So if we say, hey, we could either reduce emissions using carbon capture storage, which obviously does nothing for energy security, but does something about climate change, then that's going to increase some of these costs. And note this is in pounds because it's from a British study. There was a whole load of cases here that sort of look at various carbon capture storage scenarios and how that might increase some of these costs. One thing with carbon capture and storage, though, is that it doesn't do it, depending on how serious we are about climate change targets, there's a pretty solid argument that it's not good enough. And this is a study from Nature that looked at all of the emissions from different technologies. And this is life cycle emissions. So it includes things like pouring the concrete through a nuclear plant and building the solar panel. And this is gram CO2 equivalent. And if you look at the inset, this pink line here is where we would need to be for a 2C world, like raise temperatures only by 2 degrees C. So nuclear, wind, solar, they're sitting pretty down here, they're doing pretty well. CCS, it reduces emissions by 90%, but we need to be even lower to get to 2C world levels. So there's a pretty good argument that carbon capture and storage isn't going to cut it from an environmental perspective either. We'll move on from that. Okay, now I'm going to get to the sort of thing you actually asked me to talk about, which is nuclear costs, right? Because I've set a number and said I want nuclear power to be under $100 a megawatt hour in 2020 money in order to be competitive. Now, we think about the cost of constructing a reactor, which, as I said, is the big thing we need to worry about. We think about that in how many dollars it costs per kilowatt electric of the reactor capacity. And I can't remember the exact number, but I think to get to $100 a megawatt hour, we need to be somewhere around the $6,000 per kilowatt mark for nuclear power, right? Now, in the US, there has been attempts to build 2 new nuclear power stations recently. One is called Vogtle, and it was in Georgia, and one was called VC Summer in South Carolina. VC Summer got cancelled midway through the project, and I think the chief executive of the project is going to jail. Like he's been convicted of some sort of fraud associated with it. The Vogtle is just being turned online now. It cost $12,000 a kilowatt electric-ish, probably even a bit more now. And it was very late and very over budget, and I'll come on to that recently. Come on to that soon. Now, France and Finland also had recent nuclear constructions. They were a little cheaper than Vogtle and not much. They had similar issues. Again, I'll come on to it. What I would like to flag, though, is that China, Korea, Russia, Japan, and arguably the UAE, United Arab Emirates, deliver and have delivered projects at a level where they compete with, where if we could do the same thing, they would compete inside of that paradigm of $100 a megawatt hour I presented. In fact, quite a bit less than $100 a megawatt hour. Like I can say, if we could do this in Britain, it would just straight up compete, and we could add them. I think even in America at this level, we might be able to get them built. And we want to sort of dig into why that is. So in the West, new nuclear plants have taken 8 to 10 years to build, compared to about 4 or 5 years in Asia. Now, this creates a sort of vicious circle. If it takes you longer to build it, then you need to borrow more money to build the reactor, and you pay interest on that money. And so if it takes longer, then then everything becomes a lot more expensive because of how long it takes to get your money back by generating electricity. Now, if that happens, then because of the delays, when you're pricing the interest rate of a project, then that interest rate goes up because there's uncertainty on when you'll build it. If you don't know it's going to be 8 or 10 or 15 years to build the reactor, then people say this is a risky project. So interest rates are high. As an example, new nuclear plant being built in Britain at the moment, the cost of capital of the project is 9%. And bear in mind that started 5 years ago, right? Interest rates were rock bottom, like government costs of borrowing 0.1%, right? 9% to build a nuclear reactor, and they're paying interest for 10 years before they build it. Now, another problem this causes is it's difficult to plan on those timelines. If it takes you 20 years to decide whether to build a reactor, get it licensed, determine the site, then start building it, then spend 10 years building it, 1 year commissioning it, then everything has radically changed by the time you get to the other end. Vogtle, the plant in the US, is a great example of this. They started building it in the 2000s, or started planning it in the 2000s on the one electricity price regime, right? Start building it. Gas prices crash because fracking starts. The project looks really, really like a bad investment. And now, out the other end of the things, we're now getting to a point where gas prices are going back up again. In Europe, I'd say this is even more extreme, right? We've had a decade where people are wondering whether we needed nuclear reactors, with reactors being shut. And now Europe has seriously got problems getting through the winter without running out of heat. And the nuclear industry can't react to this on the time required to make a difference. Now, one of the big things here is that nuclear reactors have got bigger the later they were built, right? Since the 1970s, when we started building nuclear reactors, they have become larger and larger. And the reason for this was utilities were thinking, oh, if I build a reactor that's twice as big, I can make twice as much money and it will cost me less than twice as much to build it, right? An economy of scale. Now, what happened in reality was that the projects became so big and so complicated that the companies building them could not manage the projects effectively. And that meant that costs went up rather than down per unit electricity generation. And the other problem here is that the cost of a new project rose to $10–15 billion. Right? Now, that is too big for the private sector to take on these mega projects. Look at the US. this is the size of, like, bigger than the size of the utility. You need consortiums of utilities to take these on. And there's a big risk of going bankrupt if the project goes wrong. And that increases risk and it increases interest rates. Even in the UK, the new reactor project being built there, that's being built by the French state-owned utility. But the project is something like $25 billion to build 2 enormous reactors, between them a 3 gigawatt electric. And even for them, they're basically betting the company on being able to build the reactors. Now, the cost of a nuclear reactor is dominated by building the reactor. The cost of building the reactor is dominated by site labor. Right? It is all about having people in hard hats and high-vis jackets on a site, pouring concrete, laying rebar, all of that stuff for years and years and years. Right? It is not the cost of building things in the factory and shipping them to site or manufactured components is low. It is about doing things on site, along with interest rates, as I've discussed, and financing. So nuclear reactors, you have to have lots and lots of site labor for a long period of time. Site labor is expensive, interest is expensive, and that is what drives the cost of these reactors. And I mentioned before that the projects have become bigger, and that's become complicated, and that makes projects more complicated, and they take longer, and it costs more. And there's some nice data behind this, and this is showing cost of nuclear construction and size in the US. So on the y-axis, we have cost per kilowatts electric of a nuclear reactor. X-axis, you have time to construct it. So these are all the reactors that were built in the US. And then how big the dot is how big the reactor is. And there's sort of 3 groups. There's a whole load of small points over here, and they're quite expensive. And those are prototypes. Those are reactors built in the 1960s to prove out the technology. Then we got this cluster of reactors completed before 3 Mile Island, which are medium-sized, and they take quite a bit of long time to build. They're all late, but they're not that expensive. And then we have everything that finished after 3 Mile Island. And 3 Mile Island is changed things quite a bit because it caused long delays while they added loads of safety systems to reactors. But what we see is that these projects are bigger, they're lasting longer, and costs are really beginning to escalate here. So, looking specifically at what has happened in the new build recently, Votor, there's an extremely good report on this done by an institution called EPI, and I can't remember exactly what that stood for. But they basically went through and looked at everything that went wrong and came to some conclusions on what went wrong and how it could be fixed. And there's a high degree of consensus in the nuclear industry on what has gone wrong and how to fix it. Build 2 enormous reactors. Project was very poorly managed. First time the people involved had built nuclear reactors for decades. The architect engineer, which is a company that was charged with designing out the plans, was not used to nuclear construction and meeting nuclear quality requirements. They had problems like they'd start building it, they'd change how they built it versus the design. Then they'd go to the regulator, and the regulator would say that wasn't what you licensed, change it. Had parts that weren't meeting the quality assurance regime. There was litigation between project partners. So as a result, this became very late and very over budget. Now, if we contrast that to what went on in Asia, you build one project, then you go build the next reactor, then you go build the next reactor. So that means that the supply chain is capable of supplying all the components. The people building the reactors are experienced at building them, so they know how to do it properly. The same consortium and workers work on multiple projects. There's the economy of scale associated with doing the same thing multiple times. And there was effective management to ensure that where things could be made cheaper, that was learned. There's a focus on efficiency and a focus on savings. And one of the big factors was that, and this may sound silly, how complete the design of a reactor is before they started building it, right? So down here on the x-axis here, we have how complete the design was at the start of construction. On the y-axis, we have how much the reactor cost to build. This clump over here is the Asian reactors from Japan, Korea, China, UAE. This is Vocal, right? Vocal, the reactor they started building in the US, they had completed 20% of the design when they started to build it. The reason that was done is because you don't finish designing the plant until you have a decision to actually invest in the site, because designing the plant is expensive. So then you get an investment decision, say, right, we want to build this thing. And so then the decision is taken to go, oh, want to get this up and running in 8 years. Gee, we need to start making electricity. So that means I need to start building it next year. So I'll start building a reactor, the bits that I know what I'm doing, and design the rest of it later. Now, this was disastrous because things changed, right? They didn't have a complete design. So I say the regulator made them redo things. They start doing things on site and find it didn't work and have to rework it. And that meant that everything became expensive. I think I heard for one of the European projects, and we saw very similar things with the European projects, they had a problem where they built the building to contain the pressure vessel of the reactor and built the pressure vessel and took it to the site and realized they could not get it through the door. So poor design, poor management design, early on in the construction process caused a lot of problems. So a couple of the big take homes here are the projects have become too big for Western companies to manage them. This is partly because the lack of experience of building things, and also because the projects are so large that the utilities can't build multiple reactors, right? One reactor is the size of the company. And this leads to too much risk. There's not an inherent problem with large reactors if done properly. In Asia, big reactors are built successfully, on time, on budget, over and over again. But in the West, we haven't been able to do this. So,
can you, real quick, can you comment on differences of the effect of differences in labor rates as well as some of the requirements placed, different requirements placed on the contractors in these two, in West versus, let's say, West versus East construction?
yeah, absolutely. So there are inherent advantages in Asia that make reactors inherently cheaper. So we can never build reactors here as cheap as in Asia because people get paid more here and don't work as long hours. And those are not things we want to change, right? We want people to get paid well and not work hours and hours and hours of unpaid overtime. So the numbers I show, well, the numbers here, these $4,000 a kilowatt, probably not achievable in the West, right? But we don't need to get here. We just need to get about here, right? We can be a bit more expensive in Asia. And so while we can't get all the way down to Asian prices, we can get down to something that works for our energy system. To your second point on quality and regulatory requirements, the regulatory requirements and quality of Korea, Japan, for example, and the UAE by extension, because they're building Korean reactors, is as good as the US. And the reactors there are licensable in the US. I can't quite speak to the same confidence on China, but China did license their reactor design in the UK, which has a licensing regime which is as rigorous as that in the US. So, to the best of my knowledge, while not being certain, I'll make one more point on this section. There is somewhat a difference in how sophisticated some of the safety systems are on some of the designs that are being built in Asia versus the one here, right? This isn't to say that the designs in Asia are cheap knockoffs that you would never build here, right? They're still licensable here, but there's a subtle difference between the you look at the reactors that are currently being built or are currently operate in the US, those are what we call Generation 2 reactors. They rely on active safety systems. The ones that are built in Japan and Korea and China are typically what's called Gen 3 reactors, which have less active safety systems. The ABWR in particular, the one built in China, so the one built in Japan, has been licensed in the US, to the best of my knowledge. It's also been licensed in the UK. The Chinese reactor is also in this category, and it's been licensed in the UK. So they are more advanced than what we currently have in the US. However, this one, Votal, is what we call a Gen 3 plus reactor, which means it's got even more passive safety. And so it is a slightly more passive or advanced design than some of the domestic Chinese design, for example. One factor, though, that's quite telling is that, so I mentioned, where did I get this? These reactors built in France and Finland, okay, they are French designed reactors. This one is an American design reactor called an AP1000. These two French reactors called EPR. EPRs and AP1000s have been built in China by, at competitive costs, right? The same fundamental design was taken to China for both of these, and the cost was a lot lower than when it was done in the US. Sorry, that was a very long answer to your question. I hope that covered it.
Yes, it did. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so so the way we're going with this in the US, to a lesser extent Europe, and I'll digress. The difference between the US and Europe here is that in the US, right, the energy system is not the responsibility of the federal government, it's the responsibility of state governments, and everything, or most things, are privatized, right? This means that utilities are small and things have to be, broadly speaking, be privately funded, right? Although with some government support. In Europe, the picture's a bit more blended. The state will directly finance reactors, right? In France, in Britain, the state can come along, and they are beginning to do this and say, right, these big reactors are getting too big for the private sector, we will do it, or we will work with you. But both in Europe and the US, there's a move towards smaller reactors. Now, the idea here is to go down from like 1.5 gigawatt electric to something that's between 50 and 400 megawatt electric. Now, this reduces the costs, and that makes the project easier to finance, right? If you have a smaller reactor, it takes less to build it, money to build it, and therefore you can build it without betting the company on it. So the idea is to get these things down to like $1 billion or something. Now, the second thing to do is to try and get the unit cost acceptable. And two principles are used here. One is modularity, which is where you sort of build the reactor as like a nuclear flat pack and have a whole load of components that you build in a factory. We're good at building things in factories. Factories were efficient, we can keep costs down, productivity is high, we're not paying for workers to relocate to some site 1,000 miles from their family, right? We can do things in factories, optimize it, and then ship everything to site, and at site just assemble it. The second thing is standardization. This means build the same thing over and over and over again until you get really good at building it and the cost comes down. And that's not just what the design is, that's who's building it, what your supply chain looks like, and the process to make it. And we have not done this in America. In America, even when we built 100 reactors back in the 70s, 80s, each plant was a custom build. France is a good example of where they did standardize their large reactors. They built a large number of reactors in France, I think of the order of 70 over a 20-year period of 3 different designs. And the French program was cost effective. And this levers a principle called the learning rate, which is a well-known accepted thing in sort of economics or cost analysis, which is that if you build a large number of things, let's say 10, the cost of the 10th one might be 30 to 40% lower than the cost of the first one. And I apologize for the low resolution on this graph, but it comes from the US submarine program. So or submarine naval reactors. So naval reactors is one thing that gets built a lot. They find that the more of them they build, the cheaper they get. Now, you can do these things with large reactors, and well, if it is done well, then large reactors can be cost effective. In the West, this requires a lot of state intervention, and in the West, even in Europe, we don't really have the level of state intervention to do this effectively, right? It's not build one reactor, it's build 10 reactors, right? Building 10 large reactors is $100 billion, and no one in the West can finance that, including Europe. So the logic is, make your reactor small, then I can finance it, then I can build lots of them, and then it can be competitive. And for either of these, we can hit target costs, which are in the sort of $80 to $100 megawatt region, which according to the target numbers I put up earlier is well within where I think a nuclear program can get and be cost effective. Now, the leading example of this in America is called NuScale. So this is a reactor developer headquartered in Oregon, and they're interesting to us Wisconsinites because they signed an MOU with Dairyland Power to evaluate the potential of their technology in Wisconsin. And the idea here is they'll build up to 20 factory-built reactors, they'll stick them on a truck, and they'll go build something that looks like a big swimming pool at the other end and go put those reactors in the swimming pool. Now, their stated target cost was $65 a megawatt hour in 2020 USD. It will have gone up since then because commodity prices have gone up, but the cost of everything's gone up. And notably, this is even less than the figure I had on the previous slide, right? I said 80 to 100, they're saying we can do it for 65. Now, this is not proven, right? They need to build this and prove they can do it at these prices and not be subject to cost overruns or excessive cost overruns. But the way they're going about it with volume manufacture and the design addresses the points I raised earlier. I should mention there's one area where they don't, and it's possibly, in my opinion, not the best aspect of the design, is this giant swimming pool. Right, the giant swimming pool is probably quite expensive, and that's probably not the best way of doing this, but it's the way that NuScale go about it. Now, I do want to mention one thing that isn't cost related, which is sort of a siting-based thing. So another advantage we can get from small reactors comes around emergency planning zones. Now, today's nuclear reactors have 10-mile zones around them where, in the event of a very bad accident, there will be an evacuation. Now, this has never happened in the US. There are two obviously well-known examples of this. Fukushima, which I don't want to make excuses for Fukushima, but it's in terms of how we got there. A old reactor, an enormous tsunami that was not properly planned for at any level by anything in Japan, including, not just the nuclear reactors, but also there are very specific things they should have done and didn't to prepare for the tsunami at the reactor. And then Chernobyl is a very different design, so a very poor design of reactor that was unstable. And the Russians knew they were unstable and operated them to take account of all of this. And at Chernobyl, the operators basically threw out the manual and said, we know what we're doing, we're not going to follow any of these safety precautions at all. And I struggle to come up with a good analogy for how badly the Chernobyl operators operated the reactor, but it's a bit like driving down the freeway with no hands with a blindfold on because you think you're very good at driving a car. Now, traditionally, you have these 10-mile exclusion zones. And I know that for me, I'm a nuclear engineer. Like, I'm not at all worried about radiation from a nuclear plant. I could certainly understand people getting worried about evacuation zones because of Fukushima, right? Now, what NuScale and other small reactor vendors target is to not need an emergency planning zone. And NuScale have convinced the nuclear regulator in the US, which is well known for being a stringent regulator, that they don't need one outside their site boundary. And this broadly comes on from two pillars. One is a simple design with extra safety features. And the key thing here is that what really went wrong with Fukushima was that they couldn't keep the reactor cool. And they couldn't keep it cool because there was no electricity supply. And with no electricity supply, they couldn't power the pumps to keep pumping water through the reactor. Now, NuScale does this all by convection, right? Natural circulation, buoyancy. and so they just don't have the same dependence on electricity supplies, and other things. And that's the simple way of looking at it. The other thing is that the reactor is just smaller, right? If it's 10% of the size of a normal big reactor, then there's 10% of the amount of radioactive stuff in it, which just isn't that much. So what that means is that you have a reactor where we're saying that nothing's going to go wrong, and even if it does, then we can't end up with a situation with an exclusion zone. So my personal opinion, and really this is for whoever wants to have a reactor near them, but I know if they were building a reactor near me, this is something that I would value. I guess it's left for whoever might host such a reactor to decide what matters to them. A couple of other sort of bits and pieces. And Richard, how long do I have here? I'm wrapping up, but I've got a few more slides.
We have another hour, but and you're entertaining questions, so I think we're in pretty good shape.
Okay, well, I'll take my time and go over things. I'm happy to discuss things for as long as you'd like me to. So, another potential application for nuclear plants is to site them on the sites of old coal-fired power stations. So, yeah, this is one of the things that's called, we could stack up quite a nice argument here, because again, from my climate change hat on, we need to shut coal-fired power stations. They're bad for the environment, really bad, much worse than gas. But it's politically and economically difficult because justifiably people don't want to lose their jobs. So the idea is to put a nuclear plant on the site of an old coal-fired power station and then employ all the skilled workers from the coal plant. There's some possibility for site and equipment reuse as well. So coal-fired power stations have turbines, they've got electrical grid connections, they have some brownfield site stuff. There's uncertainty in how far we can take this, but as a minimum, there's an electrical grid connection, which is important. So it can offer a route to reducing costs as well. And there's a pilot plan for this in a site called Kemmerer in Wyoming, which is a coal-fired power station that's due to close. And the plan would be to take one of these new advanced designs of nuclear reactor and put it on the same site. And I think they're working with local stakeholders in Wyoming to try and make this happen. And I think there's a degree of positivity behind trying to make that happen. Another area is process heat for nuclear power, from nuclear power, right? So I presented way back towards the start, I said that most of our energy use is not electricity. Now, one route to decarbonizing non-electricity production is electrification. Now, this is probably the route we're going down with electric cars one way or another. It might take 50 years, but that's probably where we're going with things. With industrial heat, which is a major user of energy, it is quite difficult to decarbonize that efficiently. So we could produce electricity and then use an induction heater. Well, that is really inefficient, so it will be expensive. Now, nuclear plants produce heat directly. We normally convert that heat to electricity using a turbine, but we don't have to. We could use that heat directly to heat industrial processes. If we co-site a nuclear reactor with an industrial facility. And again, this can get a bit easier if the nuclear plant doesn't have big exclusion zones around it and so on, or big evacuation zones, I said. Now, some of this depends on the temperature of heat. So, and temperature of heat varies. At one end, cement manufacture is something that takes 1500 degrees C, and that's very challenging to produce from a materials perspective. The only reason that we can do it in cement manufacture is we have a big sort of furnace that's surrounded by ceramic bricks that can cope with that heat. It's difficult to move heat around at that temperature. You get to about 1000 degrees C, then you start hitting things like the petrochemicals industry, the top end of that. And also, if people want to produce hydrogen, then you can do that. And that's sort of a stretch case for nuclear power, but it's feasible. And then there's a whole range of industrial processes like ammonia production and more of a or lithium production as well, that are at the sort of 600, 700 degrees level or a bit lower. And those are areas that can't be reached with current nuclear reactors. They're about 300 degrees. But many advanced designs of nuclear reactor and to get to 600, 700 degrees or even higher. And that could provide a route to providing this heat. Finally, one interesting use case would be domestic heating. And one quite efficient way of doing domestic heating is a district energy system. And this is basically where you heat up some steam and then you pipe that steam to your home. And that's done in, our campus at UW has a district energy system, right? On Charter Street, there is a plant that heats up gas and creates steam and sends that steam to a whole load of pipes. So those sorts of systems can be supplied with nuclear plants. They are difficult to retrofit, right? My home runs on a furnace. Going and replacing all of our furnaces with big pipes carrying steam would be enormously expensive. So it requires sort of modern central planning of new estates or new facilities to provide those sorts of energy systems. And cold countries often tend to have them. So Russia, Baltic states, Finland, they all have district energy systems. Helsinki has a district energy system, and they seriously thought about supplying that heat from a nuclear reactor. It was 80 kilometers away and just piping it all that way. And the thing there is the heat you need is quite low temperature, so you can produce some electricity, then take almost the waste heat and then use that in your heating system.
Can I make a comment there? There has been discussion, in particular here in Madison, about using the gas distribution system as a heat distribution system in replacement.
Oh, really? That's exciting. I didn't realize that.
Well, it's just something that's been discussed.
Oh, that's interesting.
Can I add something? Your siting is going to have to really change. The way you talk about siting ties directly into this, because you got to have these reactors close to population densities.
Yeah, absolutely, Lou. And that there's sort of two ways to address that. One comes back to my emergency planning zone slide. It's saying, well, could you, if we were talking about a reactor that was 50 megawatt thermal rather than 3,000 megawatt thermal, which is the current ones, and it had no emergency planning zone around it, could we put them near a town? And that's an open question. Now, frankly, I'm not convinced we could in Madison. Urbana-Champaign in Illinois, their university campus is thinking quite seriously about trying to put a very small reactor on their campus to demonstrate this. So I think it depends on the site, but that's one way. The other way is you can transport heat rather a long way. So as I mentioned, the Finns seriously considered taking a nuclear plant that's 80 kilometers from Helsinki and piping the heat 80 kilometers. And with advanced district heating systems, that only gets easier because advanced district heating systems use hot water rather than steam, and there are better efficiencies and lower temperatures. So I don't have a good US example off the top of my head, but I had a student looking at this who came back and said he thought that Toronto was actually a pretty good case of this, because they have a district heating system and they have something enormous like 12 nuclear reactors that are like 50 kilometers from Toronto. And so it's one case, you don't necessarily need to build it right in the town. You go build it 20 kilometers away from the town and bring the heat in. Okay, and I also just a brief note on careers, and I phrase this as, what if my daughter son wants to be a nuclear engineer? The context of that is that I forgot to change this slide from when I gave it to a group of Wisconsin energy professionals who already had jobs. This isn't to say that you can't be nuclear engineers. I should say, what if you or your daughter or son wants to be a nuclear engineer? So one of the things we've seen in UW is declining enrollment in our nuclear engineering program. And we're not quite sure why this is. Well, it's replicated across the country as well. I'm not sure of all the reasons, but you're guessing things like and I'm asking the freshmen this last week, and I think a mix of people seeing closures in nuclear plants and thinking, oh, what would that mean for career? People thinking that the only job a nuclear engineer does is go work at a nuclear plant. And then also, I mean, one of the students in our freshman year said his parents were worried he'd get cancer from the nuclear stuff.
I think you already have a solution. You got Miss America as one of your students now.
Yes, I'm really hoping that Grace Stanky goes and solves this problem for us by drumming up a whole load of new undergrads, because by spreading the good word of nuclear energy. But I mean, a few things just to mention here. What I see is companies and labs knocking down our door asking where all the nuclear engineers are, that they need to hire them. There's strong R&D in nuclear engineering in the national lab system, so places like Argonne Lab in Chicago, Idaho Lab in Idaho, Oak Ridge in Tennessee, and many more. There's California, in Albuquerque, all over the new nuclear engineers. There's also a lot of startups at the moment trying to build advanced new designs of reactor. That includes 3 fusion startups in the Madison area, or well, in Wisconsin, I should say. UW-Madison is a big career place for careers. Nuclear plants are hiring following federal support. They need more people. And the other thing, just notice, I mean, nuclear engineers don't have to do nuclear. It's employers love engineers because combination of being able to do quantitative stuff and understanding that time and budgets are important and the real world is important. So it's a great sort of career option there as well. And I think, especially with geopolitical events, which have been very terrible and very shocking, but the implication for nuclear power is, I don't think it's going away anytime soon. Bottom line, 5 years ago, if my daughter had said, I want to be a nuclear engineer, Daddy, I might have pointed her in a different direction. Now I wouldn't. Things have changed. I think it's a bright future in nuclear engineering, a great program here. I have some conclusions. I was under the impression I was meant to talk for an hour and then answer questions for maybe half an hour, which I think Richard gave me the right information. I didn't read it properly, so apologies that I'm running short. I can talk about more things. But in my opinion, the future of nuclear energy depends on how committed we are as a country to doing something with our energy system, right? So that means, do we want to reduce CO2 emissions? Do we want energy security? And as a result, do we put in place policy instruments to support nuclear power? So things like zero emissions credits, financial support for developing technology, which is something that's happening, removal of moratoriums or bans on nuclear power. An interesting example of this recently is that a plant in California was saved from being shut down. The Californian state government had been gunning for it for years and they changed their minds. But the other thing is whether nuclear sector can learn lessons of recent cost overruns. It's not enough to have a favorable policy environment. If the nuclear industry does what it did 15 years ago, then they will fail because things will be over budget and expensive. They have some good, the nuclear industry has an understanding of what it needs to do. The question is whether it can do it. And some of the new designs, like the new scale one I presented, do address some of these factors. I don't personally see nuclear and renewables as either or. I see them as complementary technologies that need each other. I don't think we can decarbonize our energy systems with just renewable power. We're going to need something else. Similarly, as a nuclear engineer, I am perfectly relaxed about 50, 70% of my electricity coming from renewable power. I would supply the other 30%. So thank you for your time so far, and any questions you have. If there's other things you want me to speak to about nuclear power that aren't on these slides and I can dig in, I've got more details on all of this in other slides as well that I can bring to it. I can talk about some of the advanced reactor designs, whatever you'd like to do.
Very good. I'm really, really pleased, Ben. Thank you so much. I have some remarks and to wrap things up, but I'm going to hold those so that we've got 20 people here, and I think our questions have come from 3 or 4 or 5, but I'd like to see some more questions from those 4 or 5 and from others. So I'll hold off for the moment and let's I don't see anything in the chat, so we'll just let people come ahead and ask questions as they would like to.
Well, this is Stephen Shellen. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yep.
I enjoyed your presentation, Ben, but it takes me back to when I started in the nuclear engineering program, and through my career for the last 60 years, nobody has mentioned the problem of the NRC as a regulator that has been very oppressive and very non-innovative, because all of the things that you have talked about, which are very logical, repetition in design, having the design finished before you build the plant, and replication and construction where groups of trained people can go from plant to plant and build it. You're describing the 60s nuclear plants that are operating that are now being shut down. My personal example is the design for the Gunay nuclear plant, which was replicated at Point Beach. Gunay was a single unit, Point Beach is dual unit. That was duplicated pretty much at Kewanee, a single unit. That was duplicated for Prairie Island, a larger dual unit. Each of those was increased in power slightly, and over the years has had increase due to better instrumentation and efficiency of components. And having worked at Westinghouse during the heyday of those plants also, we've seen them exported to Taiwan and Japan and Korea. EDF design is that basic design. We have lost our way because we have been steered in the wrong direction by many of the NRC mandates, such as the 10-mile radiation, or the 10 miles EP zone has kept nuclear power plants from being efficient to do area heating, which China is now implementing over millions of hectares. Whereas Besnau plant in Switzerland and other nuclear plants have nuclear zone heating. And I'll stop there. I'd certainly like to talk to you sometime at UW.
Thank you, Stephen. And just to say that I very much welcome speaking to any of you after this session as well. You can have my email address and talk some more time as well. That'd be great. I'll address a few of the points you said. Probably I can't get all of them. You made an excellent point on the US being the original exporter of these technologies to other countries. Like at various points in my talk, I mentioned a French state build program that was successful, and recent Japanese builds and Korean builds of technologies. All of these, and indirectly the Chinese as well, all of these stem from American designs from the 1960s. So France started with, they started building a British design of reactor, which is different to the American one. They realized that the British one was not up to scratch, and they imported, I think maybe had domestic technology as well, and they imported technology from Westinghouse in America and successfully built their program out of that. The Japanese technology also deployed in Taiwan is based on General Electric technology, and they partnered with Hitachi and Toshiba, and all of those companies have kept going with things, but fundamentally it's American. And I think the Korean technology is based on combustion engineering, which again was an American company. And finally, China imported French technology, which means it's the granddaughter of American technology. So all of these things were highlighted in the US, absolutely, and that's something to be proud of. The cost of licensing is a big drawback. I think costs $1 billion to put a reactor through licensing, which is a lot, and it's a barrier to getting new technologies into the industry. some of the issues here that have been identified in the sources I was quoting are high regulator billing rate and a slow pace of regulator interactions. I have a few opinions on the regulatory process, which I won't share today, but I will make one comment, which is that I don't think that the regulator should be a politicized entity, and it is, as in that the people who run the regulator are appointed by the federal government, and they are often lawyers who are appointed by the federal government, and that means you have changes in regulatory policy that occur, changes in the administration, and in my opinion, that is not a sensible way of running a technocratic organization. When you have things like, so last year when licenses for operating license extensions for plants were revoked because the new commissioners did not like what the old commissioners had done. Like, I don't know how you're meant to plan for that. But to an extent, this is America. This is how it's run here. You seem to have, we seem to have, that seems to be how we decide who runs lots of things. So I guess it's the way things are. I guess then I make a point that, you know, new commissioners shouldn't change what the old ones have done. The final point to make, the one I did disagree with you on, Stephen, was I don't think the 10-mile exclusion zone excludes district heating. There's another point to make on whether there should be a 10-mile exclusion zone. But I say exclusion, I should say evacuation planning zone. It's not an exclusion zone, it's an emergency planning zone. Because you can ship heat 10 miles. Maybe the losses when the plants were built may have been too high because the district heating systems of that generation might have been steam systems that lose a lot of heat and require high temperatures. Today's district heating systems, 10 miles is not a significant drawback to my knowledge.
Well, in Milwaukee, we have a heating system for most of downtown that was supported by the fossil plant that's located in the valley, and that's done very well for decades. It's been upgraded many times, and if we had a nuclear plant there, we'd have a clean zone, which has caused for many years a change in fuel for trucks and cars when it comes to summer and smog and things like that from Chicago up the lake shore. So
I absolutely agree on the air. Sorry, Stephen. I absolutely agree on the air quality point you're making. So a personal anecdote. My wife's from Taiwan. Taiwan, they built a nuclear reactor that was imported by the Americans. Change of government never operated it. So they operate a massive coal-fired power station in the middle of the island. Air quality is awful. Breaks my heart. Like it's such a shame that you terms from an air quality perspective, much better do these things in nuclear power.
I should point out that when I was working for Westinghouse in Pittsburgh, we had a crew from Korea that we were training in terms of design and operation of plants. And we had to kick them out because we found them in the building overnight copying all of our documents. We prematurely sent them back to Korea.
Yes.
So that's what happened early in the cycle.
Yeah. I think we also had a question, if I'm not interrupting your interactions, Stephen. We have a question from Dottie. Dottie, do you want to, you had your hand raised?
Yes. During the interim, my question was that you had not addressed anything about the Nuclear Regulatory Agency and how that might be affecting costs. And you basically gave us some information and said that you would prefer not to expand on that. So if you have anything else that you want to say, like, is there any way that Americans who would like to address that could approach the issue to change the way that it is run? Or is that just, we have to accept that that's the way it is?
I suppose I should elaborate. The reason I didn't want to expand was not because I'm going to say, like, there's a whole load of like a rant that I want to take offline, but more that I'm not confident enough in my opinions on it because I'm not that familiar with the US regulatory regime. I'm much more about the British one. So for me, for me, the smoking gun one is the politicization of the entity, right? In that, as I say, if nuclear is a long-term thing, and changing what they do every 4 years based on who's running it doesn't make much sense. It has to stick to objective standards, and there's been a few instances of that, and I think that's a thing I'd be confident in saying. I think stuff that came from the literature, as I said, was speeding up the regulatory interaction and doing something about regulator billing rates. I think that the companies who interact with the regulator don't have that much control over what the regulator will bill them, and that causes them problems. There was one thing that would make a difference. I see there's a question in the chat about fusion. So the NRC also regulates fusion, and there are question marks over what the future licensing regime will look like. And I'm going to go off on a bit of a tangent here, but fusion has a much different hazard profile to fission. And the NRC is openly debating whether it will regulate it in the same way as it regulates fission. Now, one route to enabling fusion to be competitive is to regulate it in accordance with its hazard profile, which would mean not regulating it with the same framework as fission. It would still need to be regulated, but under a framework that's proportionate to its hazard. So for me, that's a big decision that the NRC has coming up, in that how they approach that could have consequences for how cost-efficient fusion could be in the US if they got it working. I'll make one more point, Dottie, which is probably more detailed than you want, but in the UK, there's two types of regulatory regime, which is you can have what's called a prescriptive regime, which is where whenever there's a new design of a reactor, the NRC comes up with a rule book and says, meet this rule book. It's like a very big checklist, and that's what's done here. In the UK, we have what's called a permissive regime, which is the polar opposite of the US one, which is basically where the regulator says, come back to me and make me a case for why your plant is safe, right? And doesn't tell you how to do it. Now, there's fans of both approaches. One downside of the US one is I think this drives some of the high costs because you have to go create a new rule book every time you do everything different. However, an advantage of the US one is the companies then know what they need to do. Whereas with the British one, you could go and produce what you think is fine, and the regulator just say, no, do it again. And so there's sort of pros and cons here of how a regulatory system is set up. And I think there's a happy medium between these that could be done, and a way that a regulator wants to go in as well. In the US, they recognize they could be more flexible with some of these new designs. And I believe a good example of a country with a happy medium, perhaps fittingly, is Canada, who has a regulatory regime somewhere between the US and the UK. And I don't know much about it, but I know that companies that interact with the Canadians tend to like it. So maybe we should all be like Canada.
I've got a quick question. I know there's some others holding out here, but since we're on the subject of Great Britain for a moment, do you have any comments to make on Rolls-Royce? I know that most of your work has been done in England with large consortiums, the European Power Reactor and such, but Rolls-Royce has an intriguing looking design for small modular reactor. Have you some thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I worked on that design in the UK. So back when Rolls-Royce were first coming up with their small modular reactor, I was the person telling them what the core should look like, along with some of my colleagues. So that was good fun. In fact, I'd probably say that's the thing I enjoyed most in my career to date. It was really good. I think Rolls-Royce are doing a lot correct with how they want to design a reactor. So I showed NuScale, and I'll pull up what NuScale had again.
Okay.
NuScale, put a reactor on a truck, send it to site. Great, fantastic, brings your costs down. And then they went and built this massive concrete swimming pool around it. Now, don't tell NuScale I said this, because NuScale is great, but the swimming pool's a problem, right? So one of the big expenses of nuclear reactors is aircraft crash prevention, right? It's the case for making sure that if someone crashes a jumbo jet into it, you don't release radioactive material, and that's expensive. And the thing that stops aircraft crash prevention in this thing is this massive swimming pool around it. You can't see the whole thing. And so that's like looking at it without knowing NuScale's cost numbers, the cost of that civil engineering structure, like, that could be expensive. What Rolls-Royce have done is they've got a reactor that's quite a bit, it's bigger than one of these new scale modules in terms of power output, but a similar size. So this is a similar physical size. So when I said 50 to 400 megawatts, when did I say that? Right here, right? New scale, each one of their modules is about 70 megawatt electric, right? Rolls-Royce are at the top end of this.
Yes.
And for me, that from what I've seen, that is the place that could give you the best overall cost benefit. And Rolls-Royce have done nothing in it, or very little that's innovative with the technology itself. What they've done in terms of like, oh, it got the fuel or the way the system design, what they've done is really go after some of these things on costs, right? They thought about, let's make everything in factories, let's make it road transportable, let's think about how we build it on site to make sure we can build it day or night. And so for me, that's an interesting project, and I hope they succeed, because I think they're going about it in some of the right ways.
Thank you for that great question, great answer. I have another quickie follow-up, if I may. I'd like to know your opinion of Copenhagen Atomic. They're very keen on thorium reactors. They're now talking about a waste burner. They seem to have raised, I think it's 20 million euros fairly recently, and looking for more. Any thoughts on that approach? Do you find it off the wall? Do you find it intelligent and optimistic? What are your basic thoughts?
So I think I approached that from a couple of angles. One is the molten salt reactor that Copenhagen Atomic's working on, and the other one is Copenhagen Atomics themselves. So I don't know Copenhagen Atomics that well. They don't have that many, I think quite a small company, and that's always difficult to go from there to building a reactor. However, the way they're going about it is also really sensible. So they're using a molten salt reactor technology, right? So in a bit. So molten salt reactors, fundamentally different technology. What you do is you dissolve your fuel in a liquid salt, which isn't that far away from what as a British person I put on my fish and chips. It's not that far away from table salt. You melt the salt, you dissolve in nuclear fuel, and then you pass it around the loop. Now the advantage of this is the whole thing just inherently keeps itself cool. The second advantage is that you can operate this thing at atmospheric pressure. Now, I talked before about how one of the problems with, say, Fukushima was they couldn't keep it cool because of their pumps. The other thing that makes current reactors a pain in the neck to keep safe and costly is they operate at somewhere between 70 and 150 atmospheres. That means they need a lot of pressurized systems to high safety grade around them to maintain that pressure boundary. It also means they need a whole load of safety systems to kick in if the pressure boundary is broken. Now, if you have a fuel and coolant that is not pressurized, that is a route to reducing your costs and giving you inherent safety. And by inherent safety, I mean safety that relies on physics rather than having a whole load of engineering systems. Now, the disadvantage with molten salt reactors is, well, the first thing is molten salt is corrosive, so you have to prove out all your materials to not corrode all over the place. And the second problem is that you've got to design a whole load of new equipment that can deal with having radioactive molten salt with lots of fission products, which can be anything in the periodic table flowing through it. Now, those are big challenges. What Copenhagen Atomics are doing is that sort of their approach to developing the technology is they are building these pumps and these valves and so on, and building out the technology by building it and testing it and breaking it and going again. If you look at a fantastic example of actually getting something done in recent years. Now, whatever you think of Elon Musk and all the Twitter rampages that are going on now and are very entertaining, he did actually manage to get with SpaceX, right, radically change the space industry, right? And the way that, to my knowledge, the way that was done was basically they just tested aggressively their rockets over and over again until they got them working. And too many nuclear engineers in the last 30 years have spent a lot of time designing things on paper without actually testing them. And that has been a cause of some problems and the cause of not getting things built. And Copenhagen Atomics is like, they've got a lab and they've got some people and they've got some salt and they're building valves and building pumps and trying to get it to work. And that could be a nice approach to getting it to work.
Yeah, as I understand it, they're starting with non-radioactive testing, and then we're going to proceed from there. I'm delighted to see that too. Good, thank you. Well, let's go back to some other questions that I've been a little negligent in catching up. Lee had a question for you. Do you want to go ahead, Lee, and ask it? Maybe Lee's not with us now.
Okay,
There you are.
basically, what I was wondering was whether the main reason that we have such a longer, are you guys hearing me?
Yes.
My connection's kind of unstable. Anyway, I was thinking that the main reason that we were having problems with longer construction times is because here in the United States, we have a lot more requirements safety-wise and in redundancies, you know, for safety reasons than in the BRICS countries. Is that true?
I would say the short answer there is no. The US safety regime is very rigorous, but then so are a lot of these other countries. So if we look at a good example of this is Japan and Korea, where their reactors they meet the same standards that the US ones do, and as a result, the key difference in cost and construction time is to do with the efficiency with which they're able to get on-site work done. Some of that is intrinsically because in Asia there are long working hours and people aren't paid very well. But a lot of it is the ability to manage mega projects effectively. And we're not very good at the ability to state intervention required to do mega projects one after the other. And that's the key factor. So just to reiterate what I said earlier on this, the Korean, Japanese, and Chinese reactor technologies are all in their own way evolutions on technology that was originally exported from America and France via America, and hence in their own way they are, if anything, safer than the current reactors that operate in the US because they're more modern. They don't quite at the same cutting edge, put it that way. Even to illustrate that point, the most modern US and French designs, the ones that we are struggling to build here, the one that went over budget in America, the ones that went over budget in France and Finland, they were exported to China. They were exported to China, Taiwan. China. They were exported to China. Same design, fundamentally, same safety principles, same level of safety, similar regulatory environment, and they built them on cost in terms of better construction practices. So thank you for your question, Lee, but that's not the main cause of our problems.
Okay, thank you.
Lou had a question that I'll ask for him. I don't think it's quite fair. He says, please talk to Edwin Lyman and others at the Union of Concerned Scientists. We all know Edward is a hyper guy on nuclear safety, but the Union of Concerned Scientists is just a union. And the only time I've heard Edmund speak something really sensible is his concern over Ukraine. He was on public television after the Russians occupied the Ukrainian reactor site, and I thought his reply was very sensible. But at other times, I'm not sure that anything you could tell Edwin Lyman that he would listen to. Ben, what do you say?
I'll leave that one to Grace Stanky. I think she'll be better at trying to convince people how to that nuclear power is a good idea. Yeah. I'll stick to telling people how nuclear power works and making cheaper nuclear reactors.
One thing I could say for Daddy's question about the head of the NRC, that is, of course, decided, as you alluded to, Ben, by the president, and you might be aware of this. Are you familiar with Alec Canara?
Sorry, I'm not.
Okay, he's a pretty senior guy from Stanford, who is many degrees in math and physics, and quite keen on nuclear energy, of course. And he has written a letter to the president, a 2-page letter. About 20 of us co-signed the letter with him about a year ago. So he has at least written to the president to express with 2 pages of pretty good science, why he might want to rethink the present chair of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So he's at least, Joe has at least seen that letter, I would expect, or some of his assistants, and made him aware of it. But that's a little bit more to the point, perhaps, because I agree with Dottie that we need to. I think they have a powerful, and you, Ben, implied without going publicly, that we need to have the regulatory philosophy of the NRC has, ever since it was created, has taken on almost an anti-nuclear stance in some tones and ways, and I think it needs to be modified.
Can I just say something? What you to
Yes,
finish,
yes, Lou.
Richard?
Yeah,
you know, that table of that graph showing expensive reactors after, 3 Mile Island and the NRC are sort of, they hit the graph at about the same point. Yeah, that graph, they hit it at about the same point. I mean, if you think about when was the NRC established, they're all right within a close together on that, and that's had to add cost to reactors, but not discounting what you said about management. How does South Korea build these big ships so efficiently, and in the US we can't do that? I mean, management is a huge deal.
Absolutely. I mean, so they're trying to build a high-speed rail link from London to Birmingham in the UK. I think they've spent several billion on it, and they haven't gone out of London yet. It's a disease that afflicts mega projects everywhere in the West. They're very difficult to deliver, and then all the nuclear safety is required exacerbate it for sure. But the fundamental issue is large construction projects. Lou, I could also speak to your question on the Gen 4 SMRs and such as Oklo, if you like.
yes.
So overall, I think there's a lot of good stuff there. So the Generation 4 reactors, as a general, the general banner that covers is anything that doesn't have water as a coolant in it. So at the moment, nuclear reactors are basically giant kettles. They have water in them, and you move that water around the circuit to power a turbine. NuScale and Rolls-Royce SMR are variants on this theme. They're still giant kettles filled with water. Now, the water is pressurized. The reason it's pressurized is because we want to run them at 300 degrees C. Now, water would normally boil at 100 degrees, and we need water rather than steam to keep it cool, so we have to pressurize the water to raise the boiling point of the water. The reason we have to raise the temperature to 300 degrees C is because otherwise the thermodynamic efficiency is lousy, because you need high temperature heat to get a decent amount of electricity. Now, there's 2 philosophies inside of high temperature reactors that get around this. One is to use a coolant that is low pressure, is a liquid at low pressures and high temperatures. And there are 2 classes of coolant that can do that. Some liquid metals and molten salts. And so both of those offer a route to cost reduction through not having to deal with pressure circuitry and not having to deal with loss of force and being more robust if they lose electrical power supplies. There's another type of reactor that sort of solves this problem a different way, which is using helium as a coolant. And the way this solves the problem is to make the reactor so big and it's such a large thermal inertia that even if they lose all the helium, the whole thing can just keep itself cool. So that's another way of getting the same problem. So there are various touted advantages for these reactors. Some of them are to do with fuel sustainability and producing less waste, and I think those are great. In the context of my talk today, in terms of what I can cover just in a response to a question, I think these do offer a credible route, if done right, the cost reduction, and it needs to be demonstrated. Because you gain one place, you lose somewhere else. What you lose in is having to develop a whole load of deal with a whole load of practical challenges with handling some different coolants. Corrosion's a big one for metals or for salts. And if you're dealing with a helium-cooled reactor, then the challenge becomes your reactor is very big. And then that's a civil engineering problem along the same lines I discussed here.
Wow, thank you very much. That was great.
Yes, that was a nice answer.
Richard, looks like Doug has his hand up.
Sorry, I didn't see that. Doug, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just going to comment on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. You were talking about its politicization, and I just wanted to. I looked at this while you were talking, and they actually have 5-year overlapping appointments, and so they in fact expire, 1 year after another. So a president hanging around for 8 years obviously will be able to completely reassemble that commission. But just like in Wisconsin with the Public Service Commission, previous appointments actually somewhat stabilized the policy that's expressed by the commission. So there's something that's, they certainly are trying to address at least part of the issue that I think you raised, and I just want to make sure everybody knew that.
Thank you. Thank you, Ed. Doug, I mean, thank you very much.
Thank you, Doug.
Yeah.
This is Tony. Can I ask a question again?
Yes, Tony.
With the molten salt discussion that we had here recently, as far as fourth generation or using metal, whichever, the concept of possibly having one of those put by one of the plants that have our spent fuels that are going to be, that particular plant might be deactivated. Sure seems like that might be a way of using up those spent fuels and not moving them across the country. Is anybody working on that?
So firstly, yes, Tony, I absolutely agree with you. This is a good thing to do with spent fuel. So one thing that could be done with spent fuel is to reprocess it, which is a chemical separation process, create new fuel which contains the long-lived parts of the old fuel and use it as fuel in these reactors. Molten salt and liquid metal cooled reactors have an added advantage, which is to do with the physics of how the neutrons behave in those conditions. That means that they can effectively create new fuel from the old fuel and hence drastically improve the utilization of uranium in the reactors. So it solves two problems. Firstly, it reduces the amount of waste we need to store, which is a major issue because there is not an agreed place to put it. And secondly, it allows us to use much less uranium. So why aren't we doing it? A few reasons. Firstly, it is more expensive than just digging more uranium out of the ground. And the status quo of just holding the waste where it is. And that means there's an inertia towards not doing it. Secondly, people are worried that one of the issues with reprocessing fuel is it can be a pathway to creating weapons material. Now, the stuff that's in used nuclear fuel is not suitable for weapons material. So directly, it doesn't do that. However, indirectly, if you started doing that, then you've got a facility that could in principle be used to make weapons grade plutonium. And so that's I think this was one of the reasons that it was previously discounted. I think those are probably the two main reasons I wanted to say. Both the other one is sort of like the chicken and the egg, and until you've built one of these reactors, you haven't got a customer for the fuel. Until you've got a customer for the fuel, you don't build a reactor to use it, and so it's difficult to get that sort of thing up and running. The French did have a huge state program around doing just that. Even with at the scale of the whole the state enterprise on the France side, they never got the whole program up and running. They never fully closed their fuel cycle. So it requires rather a lot of investment to get there. As a scientist and engineer, I would like to see it done. I think it makes more. I think it's a better technical solution than throwing waste in the ground, even if it costs a little bit more. However, someone's got to pay for it, and as I say, reactors have to get built, and all these other problems have to get solved, and that makes it difficult to get going.
Good answer.
I'm going to add, this is Steve Shellen. I would add a comment. You're not going to reprocess it where the spent fuel is sitting on site right now. And we went through the reprocessing of spent fuel from the Point Beach plant to West Valley, New York. And when Carter shut that off, we had to bring all the fuel back. So that doubled the transportation.
Absolutely right, Stephen. You have to go and you'd have to have some sort of centralized reprocessing facility to handle the fuel. You have to ship it there, reprocess it, and then take it to its final destination. Although it is a way of getting the fuel off sites, and it's a way of getting it. It's a way of trying to address the storage problems. For context, the mainline plan to store the used nuclear fuel was to build a repository at Yucca Mountain in Nevada. The cost estimate for Yucca Mountain, I think, is of the order of 100 billion. I think the view is that it's impractical to get it built because the level of state opposition is too high, and the process used to select Nevada also wasn't particularly fair. And so this leads to a sort of impasse where there's no firm solution of where such a repository would go. But the federal law states that that's the repository, so it's difficult to find an alternative even.
I heard that it was paid for and nearly done. Do you know how close it is to completion, Ben?
I don't know, Richard.
It's basically done.
Yeah.
One of my friends and co-workers at Westinghouse went to work on Yucca Mountain for about a decade before he retired, and he said basically it could be utilized as a depository at any time. It's just a matter of the state of Nevada has turned it down, and that's basically because as a completed project, it's not bringing new money into the state.
Yeah. Well, it might if they allowed it to happen and charged a fee.
Nevada's anti-nuclear right now.
Yeah, I suppose they'd rather just focus their money on gambling with more than one thing.
It's more profitable.
Yeah. Gambling with the planet, though.
I believe there was also, again, this isn't something I'm an expert on, I'm just repeating what other nuclear engineers have told me. The Nevada sort of got shafted with it early on when it was sort of decided between Nevada, Texas, and somewhat another state, and Nevada did not have a political influence to stop it. And then later on, they developed the political influence to stop it at a real politic level. But it's an example of what can go wrong if you don't get agreement from everyone up front and let people decide if they're willing to host it or not. I do appreciate what some of the people on the call have said, that the whole thing's been built and it'll be a great place to put the waste, and I think some of this goes beyond the economic incentive.
Right. Go one point on that. This is Lou. Has trans though is not a thing communities would like to see. Just judging on that train derailment in Ohio, could you imagine that being nuclear? Really, that would not go well.
Well, that's a completely different situation, Lou. Yeah. Nuclear power shipping spent fuel or new fuel is not flammable.
Yeah,
and highly contained in concrete and steel, and those things wouldn't break even on a big trail car.
Yeah, I'm aware of that, but it could leak. There could be a leak. Just the fact that it went off the rails would create a lot of consternation. I would think. And we're talking about used fuel too. Yeah, and that's what we're. But still, moving that stuff around, the amounts that we have is huge. It's a huge expense, in my view.
I agree with you, Lou, and we wouldn't have to move it if we could build some Gen 4 reactors on site, and you make waste burners out of them as well as providing energy. But the part of the problem, it seems to me, is some of these states like California and others have gotten moratoriums on building new nuclear plants. And as I understand it, some of those moratoria are based upon having waste available. Just the idea of waste. That was the moratorium that we had in Wisconsin. And fortunately, it was reversed about 7 or 8 years ago when we had slight change in the government, and the Republicans, I think, allowed that to slip through. So we removed the moratorium here in Wisconsin, but some of the western states, green states like California, I don't think they will reverse the moratorium, and we definitely need more nuclear plants than poor little Diablo Canyon, or poor big Diablo Canyon, to go. And I'm not sure that's going to happen unless storage is dealt with.
Well, again, there's the NRC input into the Diablo Canyon. Diablo Canyon sent in a license renewal.
Yep.
Then, because of the state mandate, they canceled it. And because of the recent feedback, they wanted to apply again, and the NRC refused reactivation. It said they have to create a new license renewal for plant extension. And the other item is Harry Reid in the Senate was a proponent of the storage facility in Nevada as long as the construction was going on, and it was essentially supplying thousands of jobs. And once it got to the tail end where the construction was done and the fitting of the site was very low level, and Harry Reid was gone, then Nevada changed its mind.
Okay. Thank you for that perspective, Stephen. Well, we are getting close to noon, and I think we've had a really fruitful discussion. I can't thank you enough, Ben, for starting us off and getting us along the route for lots of insights. We are going to have another speaker on a slightly similar topic on April the 17th. Jim Konka is going to give a talk, A Scientifically Achievable Green New Deal. Do you know Jim Konka, Ben?
I don't know. I'll look him up now. I'll be interested to know more.
I invite you to come and join us if you would. It would be really nice if you could. It'll be the same time, and I can send you, or you can use the same link, but it would be lovely to have the two of you interact at that. Jim is very strong on the safety of presently stored nuclear fuel at all of the reactor sites across the country. But I'm sure he will have a lot more to do with some of the myths associated with nuclear energy. So we can all look forward to that. But thank you again. We almost had Brent Ridge here from Dairyland. He wanted to come very badly, but he's being questioned or at some sort of a conference in Washington, D.C. today. So I told him that he could get I'll be sure that he gets the recording of this session, and he'll look forward to that. I imagine you know Brent Ridge, Ben.
Again, sorry, I don't know him. I know of, and I met people from Dairyland, but not Brent Ridge.
Yeah, it's really nice to have a utility in Wisconsin where there is background from his background in radiation is good to have, and he's very positive. So, and he is also, as you know, working on the new scale. So that would be great. Okay, well, I'll wrap things up unless there are any last minute questions. We've got 1 to 12 and I want to be on time.
Well, I just want to say thank you, Ben, and hope to see you sometime when I'm stopping by to talk to Paul Wilson.
Okay, same here from me, Ben. You did a fantastic job today. Very, very good. Thank you.
Well, thank you both, and thank you everyone for the discussion as well. It's been really good fun, and yeah, feel free to follow up. And if you're ever in town, Stephen, let me know.
We're a tough crew.
Stephen was one of the first graduates from your department.
I was the first graduate.
The first. There you go. Can't remember. Thank you for the correction.
And I should note that Max Carbon was on the NRC board at one point in time when they still had people with physical engineering and physics knowledge on the NRC board.
Good.
It's all political appointments now.
Yeah. Okay, well, I hope politicians will see the light someday, soon.
So.
Bye, everyone. Hope to see you next week. And thanks again, Ben. That was great.